Okay, now we're online. Hello. Another uh, session today about ZK basics in our series ZK Ask the Expert. I'm the same expert as always. I'm Robert at ZK since I don't know 8.5 years already, and yeah, today we'll just roll back a bit in the topics and just go through all the basics. In the recent months or weeks, we noticed there are. Oh, the volume is not high enough. Okay, wait. Let me see. Did I pick the right audio? Um, this
I,
important.
I think so.
The wrong audio, right?
I,
Let
I
me.
think it's the right one.
Hmm. Don't worry, I'll add the time at the end. I just can't select the volume. Make if I tick this one, is there the sound? Okay, so I'll just check if my audio device has the correct input. Is it better now if I talk? Hello, hello, hello. Okay, better. Okay, then I just go all the way to 100. Okay, so again, yeah, we noticed there are a few or many new users in our community. There are more or many people are taking over existing projects. So we thought we just go back to the basics and just introduce a few things that that I think are important to mention when getting started or taking over a project that can be easily missed in the, I would say, quite grown documentation base we have. Um, also to guide a bit which paths to take when deciding what kind of development pattern to use, because there are multiple ways to use ZK, and just to pick the suitable one for your project. And yeah, and also of course getting started, create a small example project, run it, debug it a bit, and look at a few features. I could imagine it's a bit too much for one day. We will see how far we get. If you have questions, let me know in the chat. Sometimes I read them in time and can integrate them. Sometimes I get questions before, and then I'll also try to mention the or give the ideas directly. So let's start directly. So what is ZK? I think that's something you should know already. ZK is a framework to build web applications in a browser, of course. Oh, wait, let me just open the beer. Cheers. And yeah, you build web applications with ZK with a strong emphasis on the server side, on the how to say, on the development with Java. And yeah, if you don't want to, if you don't have to, you can avoid many parts of the client side specifics and just code in your preferred language on the server side. Also, ZK is based on the servlet specification, so it's running in all the general servlet engines like Tomcat, Jetty, JBoss, WebLogic, Wildfly, Glassfish, and whatnot. And there are many right now out in the wild. Also, we have Spring Boot support if you need to run ZK in Spring Boot. Basically, all these are based on the servlet specification. Yeah, the basic concepts are, I would say, summarized in our documentation. I just go over a few keywords just to have the same idea about what or how a ZK page is or how ZK operates. When there was someone with noise in the background, there's one. I'll just mute. Oh no, it's not muted. No, looks all right. Okay, so if you haven't found so already, yeah, from time to time look into our documentation. The developer reference has a lot of details, lots of subtopics. Not everything is relevant for you, so be careful what to read, what to pick. And of course, the the main goal of ZK is to build a UI, and you compose the UI based out of components. And well, that's what we are going over. Here it explains the core concepts. What are components? What are trees of components? What is a desktop? What is a page? What is a component? And that's what I'm trying to go through. Since ZK is based on the servlet spec, I would say for the whole application, you always have the servlet application as the largest scope. This is roughly corresponding to the WAR file of your project. At a user level, you have a session. Every user has a session referenced or created for every user inside Tomcat. Oh, I think our colleague is on the screen. Proton, you're on the video. I didn't hear you. Some earphones. So you have a session for every user. That's what Tomcat creates for a new request, and it's tracked by cookies by default. Inside the sessions, we have, what do we have? Inside the session, we have one or more desktops. One desktop roughly corresponds to a browser tab in a ZK. So a single browser tab or an iframe, or if you still use frame sets, a frame inside one of these desktops. And yeah, for each of these desktops, you can have, or each of these desktops is usually displaying a Zool page or at least a component tree. Now the pages are somehow the summary of or a page is somehow a summary of components, which has a root. It's like the root of multiple components. Normally you have one page per desktop. You can have multiple pages per desktop. That happens rarely. I don't really recommend using the defer mode with include. So if you can avoid it, maybe don't do it. Just makes things more complicated, and I've seen it rarely in the wild. So you usually have one page, even if it's composed out of multiple Zool files. It's just adding more components to the same page in the default case. So don't get too confused about page. Normally you don't worry about it. So you worry about desktop and components. Desktop, browser tab, components, each of the elements you add to your page. And then there's one concept in ZK that is also special. It's called, or not special, which is a widget. It is the client-side representation of a server-side component, because in ZK they always have these, or not always, by default you have a server-side component and the client-side widget, and the client-side widget is taking care of rendering the DOM elements. So you have these three levels: server-side Java component, client-side JavaScript widget, which is a JavaScript class, and then which is creating DOM elements. When rendering, we will see this in the browser when we look into the details. I just go over this quite quickly so we can go more into checking out the example project and go into building a new project. Execution in ZK is some kind of the wrapper object around the request and response. So when a servlet request is going to the server, ZK creates an execution around it. It's just a name that we have internally to hide the details of the server, that there's a request and response, but it still gives access to the native request object if needed. And also an execution is like a transaction around the component tree of your current desktop, which means only one execution is active at a time that allows changing components within the current desktop. That's quite important when dealing with background threads or concurrent access to the component tree, which is advanced topic, so we don't cover it today. And then in general, in ZK, every page consists out of, as we've seen, components, and the logic is implemented in event listeners. So that's roughly the logic in like any other MVC framework. You have the components, and the components emit events. And inside the event listeners, you somehow change the components into something new. You add a component, you remove components, you change properties or attributes of components, like changing a label dynamically or adding items to a list view or activating a tab. Many things, or like all the things you do are done in event listeners in ZK. Okay. And then we go a bit into detail. How do we build the components? How do we build and how do we apply the event listeners? There's many ways or multiple ways that somehow play together sometimes or are more or less exclusive. But the underlying languages are Zumel, which is the Zool markup language, which is the XML kind syntax or the XML type syntax you see in a page like this. Now this is a Zool page, or has the extension Zool. And here you see components and other things, special elements we will talk about in a second. There was one specific question about the ZK element. I will look into. Then we have zscripts. You can create or implement logic on event listeners in inline script, which is good for prototyping. We don't recommend it for production use because it's slow. It's still script executing at server side, but it's not real Java code. It just looks like Java and is interpreted bean shell, which is quite an old library. It's hardly maintained any longer, doesn't have all the latest Java features. So it's really not the recommended way. But for prototyping, it's really, really useful. And we often use it in examples, in demos, to just have a single file demonstration of something. So we don't have to share multiple files and where to set up things or explain where to put a file in a specific folder structure. So if we use zscript to demonstrate something, it's not the recommended way. It's just easier to demonstrate. And I always say everything you can do in zscript can also be done in Java code. And then you have compiled Java code, you can put breakpoints, you have all the benefits of the Java virtual machine if you use Java code. And how to, or what can be done in Java is roughly covered here in these three patterns. We have MVC, MVVM, and Ridgelet. Then we have maybe some of you are still familiar with the JSP expression language, EL, which is also the same in ZK. We use the EL specification 3.0. So whatever is not explained in detail in our documentation about the EL is just the same as the servlet expression language. And also you can extend these expressions by taglib functions, which is also a very old API or an old standard to specify component libraries for JSP pages. In ZK, we only pick the taglib function part. Now you don't specify your custom tags in a taglib, only the functions if you really need them. There are some default functions in ZK that help with internationalization or there are a few others, but the URL encoding, which help if you need to address resources. And then in a Zool page, there can be other namespaces, which I'll just briefly mention because also going a lot into detail. But here you see there is a ZK namespace, a native namespace, an annotation namespace, client namespace for JavaScript listeners, client attribute for DOM attributes. There is XHTML, which is a specific component set, Zool, which is the default, shadow elements for additional templating and other kind of templating flow control, mostly useful for MVVM. But also in MVC applications, shadow, at least the apply element is quite useful from time to time. Okay, so have a look around here, and we will see a few of these later. Just close this again. Okay, and yeah, from the patterns, we have MVC pattern, MVVM pattern. MVC is the model view controller, which gives you more direct access to components. You add event listeners, you change components directly. In MVVM, which is called model view model, it's somehow a specialization of the MVC where you don't have direct control anymore over the components. You just specify your UI data in your view model and use data bindings and command bindings to bind to specific events and to update component properties. I'll have a quick example about this one. We have the, oh no, we just start looking into the details. Yeah? So what I mentioned before, you can start your project, your small example with a simple Zool file where everything is in one file. Now your logic and your markup, the UI. Here I just use a div, some buttons, one button and a label. And when the button is clicked, I use some inline listener. This is still this is also zscript. So this listener is listening to onClick, obviously, and executes at server side and sets the value to a label with the button clicked at and local time now. I just start my project. We will later create and start our own project. It's just something I prepared to quickly go over the patterns. So the prototyping, that's an easy way to start. And that's how you will see many examples. Okay, just start it and go to localhost training 1 and the script prototype. Now we have our button. If I click the button, the label updates, and every time I click it, the button is updated. And the fact, and we can verify that the event is going to the server side in the network tab of the browser developer tools. Something very useful. I always recommend looking in here. If we click a button, we see a request is going to the server side. It hopefully doesn't take too long. Here we have 12 milliseconds. And if we look at the payload, we see in the headers, we see an onClick event is being sent to the server with a component ID and a desktop ID. Something we've seen before. The desktop ID corresponds to the browser tab. So if you have multiple browser tabs, each of these will have a unique desktop ID. You will notice it's a bit longer than before. Since ZK 9.6, we increased the length and the randomness of the desktop ID. So it can act more like a cross-site request forgery token. So it's harder to guess now. And here's a component UUID, and the onClick event will be sent to the server side, and the response is an update of an attribute on our label component. Here you see it's calling set attribute on the component with the ID v1ju3. We just verify that this is our component. You see v1ju3, and it will set the label. The next time I click, there will be another response with an updated label. So you see it's going to the server side and responding to the client side. So that's where you implement server-side logic. I also have a small case of an inline zscript where I just import some Java package. So I have the local time available here. You can have other Java code here. Just specify a variable, for example, the string test equals something, and then we can output this variable here directly in an EL expression. Just reload the page, and it will output our label we just created. And these ones behave like the JSP expression language. We can output variables that are in our current scope. We can output variables and properties of variables that are predefined by ZK. There's a list in our documentation about all the predefined variables. If you need this, here I just output the application version, so the ZK version. And yeah, that's the basic example. Yeah, in a real life scenario, in your real project, you will have to decide what kind of pattern you want to choose. I will just introduce the 3 or 4 patterns, if you like, here. So in my project, I have an example about the MVC pattern. Here you see there's no more inline script code. There's only one special attribute. That's the apply attribute, which somehow links a composer class with the current component. Composer, the name, I think, originates from the fact that the UI is, of course, composed out of components, and that's what the words roughly mean. And a composer is some kind of side effect class that lets you add your application logic at specific lifecycle points of the component lifecycle. And the most common lifecycle method you implement is the do after compose method. At this moment, when do after compose is, here you see I have my composer. It extends the selector composer, which is an annotation driven class. It has quite an inheritance hierarchy. If we can see the other way, it's coming from composer X. Where's the hierarchy tree? Oh, I forgot how to use this one. So what you will, if you go into here, you will see it's coming from, it's inheriting from composer X and component activation listener. So it's all the ZK logic implemented in these composers that deal with making your life implementing your application a bit easier. So that's one thing you can encounter is the selector composer. It uses annotations. So you have these wire annotations and the listen annotations, which are the most common ones you use. Wire to wire a component by its name. The name will correspond to the ID of the component. So here we have the component has an ID, my label, and I just wire it in my selector composer as with the same name. Could be more specific and just say my label here, and then you can give the variable any name. That's up to you what you prefer. And if you're not sure what kind of syntax is available, the Java docs of Selector Composer is quite, or gives a few examples what kind of wiring syntax you can use. It's very similar to CSS. A hash is prefix for wiring by ID. You can wire by CSS class if you want to. You can wire by properties, by attributes. Also can use some kind of first child or nesting selectors. If you have a component within a component, you can be quite specific here. And then you wire your components you want to control. And in the same syntax applies here in these listen annotations. I listen to on click for the component with the ID my button. The ID my button is this one here. And what I do is I simply call set value of my label. This is changing the value property, and the label will update. And this is most of the thing that it's the most common thing. You update a component state somehow, or you add new components. Now we could just add a new component. We could say my label dot get parent. It's not perfect what I do here, but it will be this component here. And just append a new child. Append child. What could we add? New checkbox. Check me. And then we should, did I compile? I didn't compile, Control Shift F9. And I need to go to my MVC example and click the button. And now I added a new component. You can append new components. You can say my label dot detach if you want to remove a component. Oh, wait, I need to compile, Control Shift. And wait, was too fast. Wait, Yeah, the label is gone. Yeah, the label is detached. I reload the page. You see the label. I click the button. The label is detached, and also in the response, you will see the RM, which is a remove command, which will remove a component by ID, and the add child, which will add a component by ID. So this is, yeah, and these commands here will always look the same, whether you use zscript or MVC, MVVM. These instructions are the communication channel between server and client side, which will always be the same. That's why I sometimes say in support cases, to me, it doesn't matter whether it's MVC, MVVM, or a zscript. If we can reproduce the error based on these kind of responses, then we have a case or a problem description independent of the pattern that's used. These are always the ideal cases to investigate and to fix if needed. Yeah, so this is MVC pattern, the one I won't say recommend, but that's the modern one. In older applications, you will often see another composer type, which is called a generic forward composer. It predates the selector composer by a few years. It comes from a time when there were no annotations in Java, before Java 1.5. You see the history here. So this one uses a convention to wire these properties and event listeners. Yeah, this one just means if there's a component with the ID myLabel, it will just be applied to this variable here. Important for these wirings to happen, you have to call do after compose of the superclass. Otherwise, these don't happen. It's a common mistake I've done myself several times, forgetting to call super do after compose, and suddenly all my wirings don't work anymore, and you get just null pointer exceptions everywhere. So to me, it's not just a beginner's error. It happens all the time that I forget to call do after compose. So don't forget about this. And otherwise, the code is exactly the same. It's only a different convention of how event listeners are wired. And also the Zool file for it looks exactly the same as the previous one, just a different class we use for implementing our logic. MVVM looks a bit different. Here we try to avoid accessing components. That's part of the pattern. I've seen many mixing kinds of this. It's okay, but sometimes you're up to you if you mix the pattern that maybe MVVM is doing something you don't expect, or you are doing something we don't expect, and then things happen that are unexpected, of course. And it's more difficult to debug. So if you can avoid it, don't mix the patterns within the same class. But if you have to, it's still possible to access components in MVVM. But the ideal goal is not to access components. So what we do here is we just specify a view model. In the background, it will automatically apply a special kind of composer again. So it's based on the same technology. Oh, wait, there's someone asking, is the name of the listener method relevant to something? Right, correct answer, very good. If you're using the selector composer, you can give it any name. If you use the generic forward composer, you have to follow the pattern, event name, $ component ID. If you have nested components, you can also nest like this. So this would be, but the nesting goes in reverse order. This would be a parent ID. Now, if you have two buttons with the same ID inside different parents with another ID, you can do something like this. But this is about namespaces or ID spaces. I won't talk about this today. It's a bit too much. So yeah, perfectly fine. Here you have the convention name with selector composer, a free name. Good point. With MVVM, even more free because you don't even access the event directly. You just give it any name. You can even say the command can have a different name than the method. So it's by default, it will pick the method name. But if you want, you can give it a different label. And inside the MVC, the MVVM tool, you will notice a different syntax here. These kind of add and then some kind of word. These are called annotations in ZK. They work a bit similar to Java annotations. They don't really call a setter. So you will never find a set view model function on a component. It's just a meta information about the component that the bind composer will parse and initialize the listeners. And in this case, a listener will initialize the view model. So your view model class can be any kind of Java class. It doesn't need any special base class. That's one benefit. Could make it easier to test. You have an annotated method, or you have a few lifecycle methods. One important is the init method, which will be called before the children are created. So you can initialize some data that will then be used inside the components when adding them. So you can set your initial value here of your label, or you can set it statically. In this case, it doesn't matter. But if you wanted to read the initial value from a database, you do this in the init callback. And the command handler also has a special syntax because we don't access the mylabel component directly. Instead, what we do is we have a property and a getter, sometimes also a setter, to have two-way binding. And when we receive our command, now we just go back to the Zool file. We say when on click is called, please trigger the command handle click in our view model. Yeah, so we don't even care whether it's on click or something else. So we can apply the same command, we bind the same command to any event listener we would like. It could be on focus, could be on blur, on click, on right click, on double click. That makes these events a bit more these commands a bit more reusable. And here we say we just update our component property, and we tell MVVM my label has changed. Yeah, the property my label has changed. It doesn't need to have the same ID as the component. It can be any variable name. Just need to match this string to this label, to this variable name. And if you want to do the same kind of notification on demand or dynamically based on a condition, you can call the Java API post notify change. And it does exactly the same thing. Yeah. It tells ZK on this object, the instance of view model, the property my label has changed. And it doesn't need to be the view model. It can be any Java object that you used in bindings before. Sometimes forgotten, and I see just a huge view model with many properties. When it's possible to even nest them, you can have a part of the view model that represents a specific form, a box with a few controls that contains metadata about an address. And then you can just notify change the address fields directly, and you don't need to put every field into the view model. Also a bit advanced, just giving an overview, and I'm running low on time. Okay, so this is MVVM pattern. Now you have ideally no component access, and you use command and event command bindings and data bindings in the Zool file. The last pattern, which I sometimes see, not very often, but also quite useful, is the Ridgelet pattern. If you don't want to care about MVC, MVVM, or Zool files or any other syntax, you can operate ZK with plain Java. And we just implement the generic Ridgelet function with a service method, which lets you create a page and add all the components dynamically. So this one will also generate the same example. And you can, in this Java API is often also used inside the MVC pattern. If you want to add an event listener dynamically and remove it, if you don't want to, or if you can't follow the listen annotation. If you create a component dynamically, you need to add the event listener also dynamically. So inside the The Ridgelet, you just build your component tree directly in Java. I create my components, I append children, set the page of my root component, and I add an event listener to my button. Wow, this was loud. So, can you please turn off the microphone? Who was this? I don't see it. Okay, wait, I'll just mute you. Sorry. Mute. Okay. I'm sorry about this. Okay, so this is the Ridgelet pattern. The Ridgelet needs to be configured a bit special in ZK. In the ZK XML, you just define your Ridgelet. You give it your Ridgelet class, and you define an entry point. My Ridgelet. And there are multiple ways of defining the entry points for the Ridgelet, but the default one is who? Please mute yourself. Okay, thanks. Please. Okay. Because today we have the largest number of participants ever. Yeah? We have 100 right now exactly. So you're part of a historic moment. So you configure the entry point, and in the web XML, you can enable the default handler by enabling the pattern ZK /ZK ** for Ridgelets. And then we can access the Ridgelet also from our URL ZK, and here I already prepared this. My Ridgelet, same thing. I click a button, things update, and even without the Zool file, the click event looks the same. The response looks the same, set attribute. So there's no difference whether you use Java or Zool files or zscript, MVC, MVVM. It will always be the same at the network level. Okay, so I think this covers the patterns and really an overview today. Let's see if we can create or how we get started. I want to mention one thing. In some older projects, like 5, 7, 6 years plus, you might still see the old data binding. We call it the old data binding. It's deprecated, still available in ZK. You can still find it in the ZK plus dependency, in the ZK plus minus legacy dependency in case it's missing in your project. And if you're interested in details about it, read the reference or ask for support. This is not commonly used, but I've seen it several times in older, larger projects where it's difficult to take this out. And you will find this, you will see there's a specific initializer in a Zool file called annotate data binder init. And you have a special syntax for data bindings. So don't be confused. Sometimes you see expressions that looks like this. This is normal EL, and you have our data binding, which look like this. And here's some EL in the middle here. And then there is a third option that you sometimes see, which looks like this. This is the old data binding syntax, the old annotation syntax. So if you see something like this, you know it's the old data binding. And sometimes you also find maybe find examples about it. Best don't use it, don't copy paste it. Stick to the ones we actively maintain. Okay. So let's see. We have 20 minutes. Should be good to create a small example project. Our recommended way of building a project is using either Maven or Gradle. I will use Maven here. And the easiest way is to just create a Maven project from an archetype or clone an example project from somewhere. The archetype is nice because you start from basically 0. So we just go to the website that mentions or that explains how to use the archetype. You will see there's a command that works in older Maven versions. If you have a newer Maven version, you need to use the old archetype plugin because we haven't prioritized yet to update the archetype. So it's still using the old format. It still works. It just needs an older version of the Maven plugin to build a new project. We copy the command and we paste it to our command line. You could use the same from the IDE, but I prefer command line because then I can just show that it works independent of any development tool. And my favorite starter is always number 4, the ZK EE eval archetype web app. There's a Spring example, Spring JPA, which I think I haven't touched for a long time, so I wouldn't depend on this one. There's a CE archetype, which is interesting for the community edition. The other ones are very advanced. Their component and custom extension I will not cover today. And the stuff below here, I also won't talk about today. So we just pick number 4. Give it a group ID, just a Maven group ID, or what to call it, ZK example training 2, our second project today. No, ZK example, I don't know what to call it. I think the artifact ID is training 2. Training 2, just make it unique. Default version, package name, and just use the defaults. Yeah. Now we see it created a folder training 2. You can go into it, training 2, and we see, let's do find. Now we see the structure it created. It created a POM file, which is the Maven dependency file and the Maven configuration file. It created the source structure with a custom, with a basic view model class. By default, we use MVVM pattern, but it shouldn't stop you from switching it out into something else. The assembly is something, it's just an example of how to package your application. I usually remove this. I don't need this for my purposes. And if you have a larger project, you will use something else. And then there's the default web app folder, which contains the ZK XML, ZK's config file, web XML, the servlet or Tomcat config file, and the basic ZUL file, and some metadata. I also usually delete. I don't really use these files actively myself. And it creates some Eclipse project settings, which I think you don't need by default. So what you can do is we can build the project, a Maven clean package, which will generate the WAR file. Now, if you haven't done already, it will also download all the dependencies it needs. So you will see the target folder contains a WAR file now. And if we want to run it, it already has a run target. We can always say Maven jetty run, it's the run task. It will just run a test server. I think I have to stop the one in my IDE because I use the same port by default. Come on, stop it. Okay. Okay, so server is running. You see it complains a bit about logging because ZK doesn't ship a logging implementation by default anymore. So you have to pick your logging appender so it doesn't interfere with your projects. It always outputs a warning that this one is an evaluation copy, just so you don't forget to license in a production environment. Okay, and if we run this, we go to 8080 and reload, and it will create the project as we called it, training 2. It will generate a default page which already works. We see we can click something. We have our client server interaction. So that's the easiest way to get started. And we can even change files here. So if we say, what do we say? Nano source main web app index.zul. If we change this to and say hello. Now I need to save, of course. Save the file, save, and then we reload here. It says hello. So by default, you can change the Zool files already without restarting and see the changes directly after a browser refresh. And the same will happen if you also run the target inside Eclipse or IntelliJ, whatever is your choice. So that's the easy part. We have a running project, and now we can import it into our IDE. In IntelliJ, you go to the module settings, open module settings, and we have our project set up. We go to modules and we just pick the plus import module. We pick the one we have here, training 2, just we created, just the one we created. It's a Maven project, automatically detected. You see it added this to my current modules in my workspace. And just say OK. And then it will appear here in my list as a new folder. And the blue icon already indicates that it has detected this as a module. And in our Maven tab, we will see it has all the dependencies it includes. So it's already there. Did we stop this one? I think it's still running. So stop the command line. If we want to run this from server side, I think we just say here project. The easiest one is to click here, go to the plugins, go to the JT plugin, and you select the run. That's the same thing as running it from command line. I just say run maven build. Excuse me, wait. Excuse me, I'm in the call. Thanks. Yeah, so already clicked run. No, it's running. It says JT is started. You see again, it's complaining about the logging a bit, but we have the running project now from our IDE. Same thing here. We can use our components. We can go into our files and change things. Test and reload. And the files update. If you have a different experience in your IDE, maybe refer to our other sessions like this we did before, where I talk about efficient development, where you can improve the feedback loop. Then I don't use the Maven target anymore to run a project. Then there are different ways of running a WAR file project. Wait, sorry, you're not muted. I'll mute you. And this will even reduce the startup time or avoid the startup completely, even if you change Java files and recompile them in live. Yeah, so this is a new project. If we want to add something here, we can. What was my plan? What did I want to mention? Just remove this a bit, make window bigger here. So we already have a static Zool file. Yeah, we have zscript we've already seen. We interact a bit with MVC, MVVM. In this case, we have MVVM. In the default example, the index Zool has a view model. It's still using the fully explicit way to start the view model. So the apply bind composer will happen automatically if you apply the view model. But to be fully correct, this will be the composer that's added or that is used internally when applying a view model. As you see, just to illustrate that MVVM is still based on the underlying MVC capabilities of ZK. There's another thing called view messages, validation messages. If you look into the MVVM documentation, you will see them also mentioned during a form validation. It's not used in this example. Just a bit more to say a bit more complete than my case. But also most of them are advanced topics, too much for half an hour or for 1 hour. What can we change? Maybe we want to compute something. You say count times 3. We just change the file a bit and go back to the browser and reload the page. And you see it's multiplying by 3 every time I click. So you have these potential live changes. And what else do we have? Interaction MVC, MVVM. Yeah, we've seen this. If you want to include pages, there was one now I go to the question I received earlier. There was a question what the ZK attribute is about. In general, you don't need it. You can remove it. It will just work as well. But sometimes you have maybe multiple components at root, like button. Now it's no longer a well-formed XML file. And if I reload the page, it will just give me a parse exception because the XML didn't parse. And in this case, if you have multiple root elements, you will definitely need a ZK XML element around or any other element. But the ZK is not a component. It's just some kind of control element that makes it valid for XML parsing. So it allows multiple root components without adding the extra DOM elements at client side. The ZK element has extra logic. Now you can have conditional expressions here. For example, if ZK, if application dot version greater 9. If it's bigger than 9, we only display the block, otherwise it will not. And we save and we reload. So I think no, it can't have the closing tag here, greater than. Now this is EL syntax. So I retry again. Do you know what I did wrong? If greater than or lower than, right, lower than 9 would be the opposite. No, it doesn't. Okay, just try to show something without testing. I think string comparison is different. Just say if true. Now, if true will show the contents, and if something evaluates to false, it will not show the contents. And this is often used to check permissions, to add and remove a component statically based on user roles. You could have a role object somewhere set in your global scope. Also advanced topic, how to set a variable somewhere. A role, I don't know, is admin. Yeah. And if this flag is true, then this will be shown. Otherwise, it will not even be created. So it's one takeaway. You could make a component visible or invisible, but these, even if a component is invisible, you will still get it at client side. Yeah? So you say visible false, the button will still be displayed at client side. And I'll just remove this. So be sure to not just hide the component if you want to really make it inaccessible. Here, we had it here, up here. So there is still the button. Yeah? So if you really want to add or remove it, you can surround it by another ZK element. You can have many ZK elements and just put the condition here, if false. And now it's inspect element. Now it's no longer there. H layout, div, H layout inner. There's my span, the label, and there's no button anymore. Yeah. So the button has completely disappeared. So this is a way to both securely remove components from a Zool file. You can always use Java to add, attach, and detach components. Yeah, but from a Zool file, if you want to really not create it, so it will never be there, you can use these static if elements. So this was just to capture the ZK element. There's more the ZK element can do, but in most cases, you will just see it and wonder why it's here. It's to surround everything. You can do XML namespace declarations here, which is also a bit advanced. XML namespace, for example, the client namespace we always call W for widget. Just has an unfortunate name, client, because client is everything in the browser. So we call it widget. And now you can specify a client-side listener on click equals. And now here, this is now JavaScript. It's no longer Java code or server-side bindings. This is now client-side code declared by this namespace. But also advanced topic. But that's something you can use the ZK element for, just to summarize some information you don't want to mix with your root component. Or if you have multiple roots, just surround everything by this kind of component. And then there was the question whether or not to use include or the apply element, because both somehow serve a similar purpose. If you have some kind of, or not if, you will have some kind of application that consists of multiple pages. So you have some kind of included.zul. And also here we just say it's a ZK and hello include. Okay. And in both cases, you can nest it. You can nest this element here. We'll just say, what is it called? Included.zul. No, just duplicate the line. And here it's called template URI. So they both do, seemingly they will do the same thing. Now we will include the same thing twice. But there will be one major difference is the include creates a div around it. The apply does not, because the apply element is a shadow element, not a real component. It's one of these control structures at server side that allows you dynamically control components via MVVM in the same way the include does, but without the extra div around it. And sometimes the surrounding div will maybe break your layout, or there's one advanced thing, and include is also an ID space, which I haven't covered today, which will hide some variable names. So the general rule is, if you can, if you have the dependency ZUTI, which is part of ZK Enterprise Edition, you can use apply, and if it's available and it's what you need, use apply first. Try to use apply, and if you have ZK Community Edition, you have to fall back to the include component. Be careful, include has some weird behavior that you don't want to run into. If you add parameters to the URL, for example, it will run into a specific mode is called defer mode. There is a mode defer, and then things behave strangely. That's what I meant earlier. When you have multiple pages in one desktop, don't do this. Don't add, but only if you really know what this means. But don't accidentally add a parameter here. If you want to pass parameters into a Zul file, just do it here. You can have any kind of custom parameter. Just param 1, 2, 3, or give it any names like address equals, and then this can be a how to say, a complex object. Doesn't have to be a string. The URL parameters are always strings, but this can be any object. So careful with include. If you can do it, use apply. Otherwise, use include with a single source and no parameters. Otherwise, it will flip into a different mode, which is hard to explain, hard to debug, and it's more for legacy integrations of adding a JSP inside a Zul file. And this is a rare case. Don't do this by default. Okay. Because they are running out of time, I said we do 5 minutes more. Let's see. So what do we do is, yes. In the browser, there's a few things that happen behind the scenes. So if you don't know what ZK is doing, we've already looked into the events and updates. We've seen that the event is sent in the request, and the response contains the dynamic updates of for the page, like setting attributes, adding, removing components, and page create or page, let's say desktop, maybe better. Desktop page creation has a slightly different protocol or protocol behavior. So if we check the network, you can say preserve log, and then you will notice what happens. Always, if you control click, you can say what you want to log. You can say all, and you have all the JavaScript resources. But if you want to debug ZK, it's often useful to use doc, which is the HTML result, so the Zool page, and XHR, which are the Ajax responses. Or if you have enabled WebSockets, right now we haven't enabled it yet. And if you reload a page and the preserve log is enabled, you will see how the old page is destroyed. It needs the other. Depends a bit on the browser where you see this. Yep. Please remain muted. Okay, so what we just clear the log again. So we refresh. So what we see is this kind of ping request. This is the request, the last message the browser sends to the server to remove the desktop from the session. Now that's how we close the circle. Now, if you somehow don't see these ping requests anymore, you might run into memory leaks, because then the server side doesn't clean up the desktop instances, and you will run out of memory earlier, depending on how many desktops you allow per session. But this is another configuration. Default is 15. Ideally, you have this request which will remove the desktop. It's called RM desktop. You will see somewhere in, where do we see this? Chrome doesn't show this nicely, but it's a request that goes to here, and the ping just indicates it's a special beacon request, because there's very limited what kind of requests you can send to the server when a page is closed. So it's a beacon request that will be the last live signal from the page telling the server, please clean up. If this doesn't happen because of browser crash or network disconnection, the page will remain at server side until the session times out, or until it's kicked out of the session when there are much more desktops active at the same time. So whenever you load a page, you see one page gets cleaned up and the new page gets created. Sometimes you see the order vice versa, depends a bit on the network timing. So it could be that the new page is created before the old one is cleaned up. Depends on how the browser prioritizes these beacon requests. And then the new page creation looks quite nice. Here you see again similar commands like we've seen before. In the update requests, we see ZK is creating components. It almost reads like a book. You can see there's a window, H layout labels with all the components you see at server side, now with their JavaScript widget name. So these are JavaScript classes. And there you see the properties, the label with the value hello include. Also, you see the version of your ZK installation. You see which other JavaScript files are loaded statically, and CSS files. So it's an easy way to debug. If you don't see a component on a page, this is a place to check maybe why a component is not rendering. Now here you can check, is it in this list? And if it's not in the list, then the server didn't create it properly. If it's in the list and it doesn't show up, it's maybe invisible, or the client engine had a problem rendering the component. Then you will often see error messages in the console if something broke. or if the client side freezes. Always look in the console for error messages. This makes our life in the support team easier. If you have a problem, if there's a message you could already have seen in the console, tell us immediately in the request, in the email. Then if you have, sometimes it makes it easier to find the root cause. Okay, so lifecycle. And to wrap up, so if you need help, we have, of course, our professional support, where me and my colleagues are answering in our help desk system. So you can apply for support, or if you're an enterprise customer, you most likely already have some support hours in your package, so you can connect us. Of course, the documentation is available, and we have our community, our forum, which I think most of you already know. We will try to be active in the forum. And a new thing we just tried last week or 2 weeks ago, we started a Discord server to see maybe we can get a few of you join the Discord to help out each other in the community. And if there's something we can help with that is not too time consuming, we might also show up in the Discord. We can't guarantee it, and we can't guarantee we keep it up for a long time. Maybe we get spammed. We will see. I just put the link in the chat, and also I will provide the link in the source code. Yeah, I think that concludes the ZK introduction. It's a lot to cover. Maybe let us know in the feedback what we can talk about next. If there's if we can find there is a specific topic we should go into more detail. We're always eager to learn what's most useful to you, so we can plan for the next session. Yeah. Well, I'm really happy that so many people joined today. Hope you join next time again. I'll keep the chat open for a while, for a few minutes. And if you have something you want to say something, happy for feedback. And yeah, happy getting started with ZK. You will find lots of things, learn new things, learn old things, and we are here to help. Okay, see you next time. I'll stop the recording.